That was the Mexican journalist Javier Valdez Cardenas before he paid the ultimate price, his life, for relentlessly exposing the drug trafficking ring in Sinaloa, Mexico. But as devastating as his death was, he is just one example of many journalists mercilessly murdered by these criminal organizations. So here are 5 of them who pissed off the wrong cartels. Number 5, Jeanette Bedoya Lima. That was Jeanette Bedoya Lima receiving an award for her bravery as an investigative journalist in Colombia. But that's just one side of her story. The other one entails her getting kidnapped, raped, and tortured not once but twice. In 2000, the first time this happened, 26-year-old Bedoya was working alongside Ignacio Gomez, another investigative journalist, at the Bogotá daily newspaper El Espectador. At the time, she was covering a critical story on the Colombian war against terrorism. While investigating a story on arms trafficking by both state officials and the paramilitary group called the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, she received an invitation from a convicted killer, simply known as the Baker. He wanted to meet with her and provide information at the infamous La Modelo prison near Bogotá. She went with an editor and a photographer, but when they arrived, things took a sinister turn. The photographer and editor stepped out for a few minutes while awaiting clearance from the prison wardens. By the time they returned, Bedoya was gone. No screams were heard, no signs of struggle, and certainly no witnesses willing to speak. Bedoya later revealed that she was approached by a man with a scar over one eye who wore shiny shoes and shoved a gun below her waist. He escorted her out of the prison facility through another exit while the prison wardens watched, showing no remorse. A mysterious group of men then beat her unconscious and sexually assaulted her while repeatedly saying, "Pay attention. We're sending a message to the press in Colombia." When they were done, they dumped her semi-conscious body by the roadside. By evening, a taxi driver discovered her and immediately drove her to the hospital. Bedoya barely survived the attack, and you might think she'd quit or run away like any ordinary person would. Right? Wrong. Like Vincent van Gogh once said, Bedoya had put her heart and soul into her work, and she had lost her mind in the process. She didn't quit. Instead, she doubled down on her quest to uncover the truth. Sadly, this led to another kidnapping, and this time, they were even harsher. In 2001, a year after the incident, Bedoya was hired by El Tiempo, a Colombian newspaper, where she was put in charge of law enforcement coverage, including reporting on the war between the FARC guerrillas, the paramilitary group, the armed forces, and the Colombian government. Before this, Bedoya had received international recognition in the United States for her unwavering commitment to journalism. A senior FARC commander was alerted about the situation and ordered her release, apologizing on behalf of the leader responsible for the kidnapping. By this time, Bedoya had become a household name in Colombia. Any harm done to her would have triggered not just a national crisis but also questions from international organizations. This is one reason why Bedoya is still alive today, alongside the gradual decline of Colombia's drug trafficking scene. Bedoya had the face of journalism in Colombia. But the next journalist on this countdown is regarded as her Mexican counterpart. Number 4, Anabel Hernandez. In 2010, there were many people who wanted Anabel dead, the Sinaloa cartel, the Mexican government, and even a faction of the US government, all because of a book she wrote that exposed their dealings in detail. She became a wanted person in Mexico and had to flee the country with her family. But this wasn't the life she always wanted for herself. Born in 1971, Anabel dreamed of being a lawyer as a child. However, that dream couldn't come to fruition after she noticed the bias in Mexico's news reports on the drug war. Numerous killings were happening in different states, but far fewer were being reported. Reporters and journalists shied away from covering these stories to avoid getting killed, but not Anabel. At just 21 years old, she started her own newspaper called Reforma. She was still in school at the time, and her first front-page story was about electoral fraud in Mexico City. It was a powerful piece that grabbed the attention of many. 3 years later, Anabel was pregnant with her first child. By then, her work had caught the attention of the Mexican government. She kept changing jobs due to unofficial reports of government attempts to censor her work. This didn't stop Anabel, but it. Anabel's brother went to the location and discovered a horrific scene. The car was parked by the roadside, and Mr. Hernandez's shoes were in the trunk, stained with blood. By that evening, his body was found on a highway outside Mexico City. He was confirmed dead. This man was a victim of Annabelle's war on the entire narcotics underworld. The police told the family they'd investigate the murder only if the Hernandez family paid them to do it. At this point, it was clear that Annabelle had suffered a devastating loss for angering the powers that be. But she wasn't ready to retreat. Instead, she wanted revenge. In 2001, while working with a major newspaper in Mexico, Annabelle exposed a story about how the then Mexican presidential candidate, Vicente Fox, used public funds extravagantly to decorate his personal space, despite his campaign promises of economic austerity. The newspaper revealed expense reports from President Fox's government, uncovering overcharges, unverified purchases, and connections to non-existent companies. The story gained international recognition and even earned Annabelle an award. But she didn't stop there. In 2010, she released a book that exposed in grave detail the relationship between the cartels, El Chapo, the Mexican government, and the United States. The book took 5 years of research and was titled Los Señores del Narco, translated as Narcoland, the Mexican drug lords and their godfathers. According to the book, Annabelle claimed that the government, its policies, the military, and Mexico's financial sector were structured in ways that empowered the cartels and made drug trafficking possible. She went further, stating that under President Vicente Fox, the relationship between the cartels and the government shifted as Fox sided with the Sinaloa cartel, even allowing El Chapo Guzman to escape prison in 2001. To top it off, she alleged that the DEA had secret deals with traffickers, allowing the illegal importation of fentanyl and methamphetamine, and that the agency made billions of dollars off this trade in the U.S. Annabelle was like a one-woman army, ready to burn the entire narcotics underworld to the ground. Sadly, they fired back. Annabelle received multiple death threats from the Mexican government itself. One of the officers she specifically exposed, Genaro Garcia Luna, who claimed to fight against drug cartels while secretly receiving millions in bribes from the Sinaloa cartel, tried to assassinate her. He sent men to her home, but luckily, she was out that day and escaped death. As courageous as she was, Annabelle was still human, and she feared for her life. This ultimately led her to leave Mexico a few months later. Despite all her efforts, the corruption in Mexico still stands, and the cartels continue to reign supreme. But at least she achieved her goal. I'm glad that I'm still alive to be able to publish these stories because I think that people deserve to know. People need to know what is happening there. Number 3, Enrique Quintanilla. On August 9, 2006, the bruised and lifeless body of Enrique was found outside the city of Chihuahua with 2 gunshots to his head and back. This was his punishment for crossing the infamous Juarez cartel. However, they weren't the only ones after him. A faction of the Mexican government also wanted him dead. And the reason behind this cruel vendetta? Almost unbelievable. Enrique's journey to becoming a target of both these groups began when he launched his investigative magazine, Dos Lados, Una Verdad, 2 Sides, 1 Truth. He founded the magazine in 2005 after working 20 years as a crime reporter and investigative journalist. His mission was to expose the men behind the countless homicides and drug trafficking operations in Chihuahua. Chihuahua at that time was one of the most dangerous places in Mexico. While it was officially governed by state officials, the Juarez cartel held true power over the region. This cartel was responsible for transporting billions of dollars worth of illegal drugs into the U.S. At the same time, they were engaged in a brutal turf war with the Sinaloa cartel over those same borders. This chaos led to an epidemic of violence, with countless homicides both within and outside the city. Chihuahua was also plagued with rampant corruption, particularly among police and government officials. Tons of cocaine couldn't cross the border without someone turning a blind eye, and those blind eyes were paid for with millions in cartel bribes. Anyone who dared to interfere faced a grim fate. Chihuahua, in essence, was a modern-day Gotham City, and Enrique Quintanilla took it upon himself to play the role of Batman, trying to bring justice to the chaos. Unfortunately, in this version, Batman didn't survive. Before his tragic demise, Enrique used his magazine as a platform to fight for justice. The publication was strictly crime-focused, heavily criticizing the Mexican government for Chihuahua's soaring homicide rates and the violent cartel executions. He also exposed corruption, unsolved murders, and drug trafficking activities. His relentless pursuit of the truth made him a target. He was harassed multiple times, but his resolve remained unshaken. Days before his death, he published a damning exposé complete with photos and documents implicating several government officials in the drug trade. Among those named was the then governor of Chihuahua, José Reyes Beza. This revelation became the catalyst for Enrique's assassination. On August 8, 2006, Enrique was last seen leaving his office around 11 a.m. He never returned home that night. His family reported him missing the next day, and Mexican authorities found his body dumped along a roadside. The lifeless body bore harrowing evidence of torture in 2 gunshot wounds from a .45 caliber pistol, one to the head, the other to the back. Police initially suspected the war's cartel, citing the execution-style murder as their hallmark. However, this theory would be challenged years later. On October 12, 2012, Mexican media outlet TV Azteca received a video from an anonymous source. The footage showed 2 naked men bearing clear signs of torture, confessing to Enrique's assassination. The men, Leopoldo Rodriguez Garcia and Armando Duarte Escobedo, were interrogated by an unseen individual and admitted to killing Enrique under orders from 3 war's cartel drug lords. But the story didn't end there. Weeks later, another video surfaced on the Mexican news website El Diario de Chihuahua. This time, the brother of Chihuahua's State Attorney General, Mario Ángel González, was seen handcuffed and surrounded by at least 5 masked gunmen armed with assault rifles. In the video, the man claimed that his sister, Patricia González, the State Attorney General, had ordered the executions of Enrique Quintanilla and another journalist, Armando Rodriguez. The videos fueled speculation that the cartel was attempting to shift blame, perhaps under duress. However, the real killers and the true motives behind Enrique's death remained clouded in uncertainty. Tragically, the violence didn't stop with Enrique. Years later, gunmen killed one of his sons, Jonathan Perea Cardenas, further compounding the family's suffering. Number 2. Javier Valdez Cardenas. On May 15, 2017, Javier Valdez Cardenas was brutally shot 12 times by an unidentified gunman in Culiacán, Sinaloa. His death marked the end of decades spent exposing the Sinaloa cartel and its illicit operations. But how did it all happen? Javier was born on April 14, 1967, in the very city where he was later killed. As a teenager, he became intimately familiar with the violence that plagued the area: cocaine, meth, kidnappings, human trafficking, you name it. But unlike most other teenagers who felt powerless against the system, Javier had the courage to take a stand. After earning a degree in sociology from the Autonomous University of Sinaloa, Javier began his career as a reporter for the national TV station Canal 3. That was the start of an extraordinary journey. During the 1990s, he worked for several news stations but soon became frustrated with their reluctance to fully address the realities of organized crime. To be clear, this wasn't necessarily due to corruption, it was more a matter of playing it safe. But for Javier, this wasn't enough. In response, he founded his own newspaper, Rayados. This publication was both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it allowed Javier to uncover the darkest secrets of organized crime. On the other hand, it made him a prime target for these criminals. Despite the risks, Javier refused to stop. He published several books on drug trafficking, some of which earned international acclaim. One standout work was Miss Narco, which explored the lives of drug lords' wives and girlfriends, shedding light on the exploitation and debauchery many of these women endured. To understand just how dangerous Javier's work was, consider the context. In 2006, Mexican President Felipe Calderón launched a massive crackdown on drug cartels, deploying 6,000 Mexican army soldiers to Michoacán and Sinaloa. It was one of the bloodiest chapters in Mexico's fight against organized crime, with over 14,500 people killed in just 3 years. Amid this chaos, Javier continued his work without bodyguards or weapons, delving deeper into the Sinaloa cartel's operations. But his efforts did not go unnoticed. In September 2009, an unidentified assailant hurled a grenade into Rayados offices, causing extensive damage to the building. Thankfully, no one was injured. This attack followed the publication of an explosive piece titled Hitman: Confessions of an Assassin in Ciudad Juarez, which had stirred public opinion less than 24 hours before. Remarkably, Javier continued his investigations despite the threats. For a time, the attacks and death threats subsided. However, he once again provoked the ire of the Sinaloa cartel in 2011. That year, Javier was awarded the International Press Freedom Award by the Committee to Protect Journalists in New York. In his acceptance speech, he condemned the violence in Mexico, holding both citizens and the government accountable for perpetuating the drug war. His words angered not only the Mexican government but also the Sinaloa cartel. The repercussions were inevitable. On May 15, 2017, Javier was gunned down in broad daylight, just a few blocks from his office in Culiacán. He was mercilessly shot 12 times. Despite the severity of the crime, Mexican authorities failed to identify suspects or leads. There was no justice. His murder was widely condemned, drawing reactions from the U.S. Embassy in Mexico, the United Nations, and the European Union. Javier left behind his wife, Griselda Triana, also a journalist, and their young daughter. Though Javier's life was cut tragically short, his work did not die with him. Riodos was continued through the efforts of organizations like Forbidden Stories and the German newspaper Die Zeit Online. His legacy of fearless journalism lives on. And number 1, Rodolfo Rinzon Teresina. Rodolfo joins the long list of journalists murdered for speaking against cartels and drug trafficking in Mexico. But, unlike others, Rulo died at the hands of one cartel that rarely targets journalists, Los Zetas. On January 20, 2007, 5 alleged members of Los Zetas reportedly kidnapped, tortured, mutilated, and burned his corpse in Tabasco, Mexico. What led to that brutal attack began with his job as a journalist and investigative crime reporter for a newspaper called Tabasco Hoy. Rulo was known for being very direct in his news reports and articles. As a result, he received numerous death threats from suspected drug traffickers. At the time, Los Zetas, a breakout faction of the Gulf Cartel, operated in the state of Tabasco. If you are not familiar with this group, allow me to educate you a bit. This cartel is infamous for its brutal tactics, including beheadings and indiscriminate violence. Their top leaders emerged from the Mexican army, making Los Zetas one of the most violent cartels in Mexico. For context, they were one of the largest cartels in terms of geographical presence in Mexico, even outshining the Sinaloa cartel. Just like their rivals, Los Zetas were deeply involved in drug trafficking, assassinations, extortion, kidnappings, and a multitude of other illegal activities. Now, you understand the type of people Rulo was dealing with, yet he wasn't afraid to expose them in his writing. However, this defiance came at a cost. On January 20, 2007, Rulo called his wife from work, telling her he would be home by late afternoon. But as we now know, he never made it back. That day, Rulo was working on an article about a group of bank robbers in the area and gangsters extorting cash machine users in Villahermosa, Tabasco. He left the office around 8 p.m., and that was the last time anyone saw him. January passed, February came and went, and then March arrived with no word or lead on Rulo's whereabouts. On March 1, 2010, the Tabasco state authorities announced in a press conference that Rulo had been kidnapped and killed by 5 alleged members of Los Zetas in retaliation for an article he published the day before his abduction. But here is where things take a strange turn. A couple of suspects confessed to the kidnapping and gruesome acts that killed Rulo. They claimed his body was burned inside a metal barrel with diesel fuel, along with at least 4 other unidentified victims. However, this confession was the only basis for the claims. No evidence was found to corroborate the suspects' statements. Despite the lack of evidence, the police closed the investigation, and nothing further was done. This left his family and friends with questions that remain unanswered. What if the police had no real idea what happened to him and fabricated this story to appease the press? Why was the investigation closed without any concrete evidence to verify the suspect's claims? And, finally, maybe the most pressing question: why haven't you liked this video and subscribed yet? Go ahead, smash those buttons. At the end of the day, these stories serve as a stark reminder that being a journalist or crime investigator is an incredibly dangerous job. They must have adequate protection from the government to keep them out of harm's way.